We're here to discuss some of the new aspects that have been brought about in the latest NCF that has been released. NEP, as you all know, was approved by the government in 2020. It's taken a while thanks to the pandemic. Also, schools have been shut, and last year in 2022, NCF for the foundational stage as a document has been released by the government, and it is quite an amazing and intensive document. So it was our intention today to sort of run you through some of the things, some of the highlights that have been mentioned there, and see how does it work from a school implementation perspective. So let's get started. Here are some of the very, very broad outlines which are covered in the NCF. It covers everything from why we're doing it, how to do it, some illustrations, a lot of links to what's going to come later on, what teachers need to do, and many other aspects. So since we can't cover everything in today's session, we'll definitely try and get into how the school implementation side needs to happen and what is the aim of doing all of this. So let's start with NEP 2020. It had a very clear-cut thought and guideline in terms of making India a high-quality education country, which means access for more children, and education not limited to just rote learning or just basic literacy and numeracy, but going beyond that into thinking skills, cognitive development, and much more, which is fantastic in terms of its thought process. So these were the guidelines given by the NEP before the NCF came out in terms of which direction should we be headed in. Once this, let's look at some of the thought processes that went into NCF per se. So NEP gave those guidelines, and then NCF has picked up things from various sectors, from educationists in India, from educationists outside India, systems that are being working well for many years. So everybody from Swami Vivekananda's thought process to Savitribai Phule's thought process, there's been a little bit of everything. And of course, most great thinkers have pushed towards just higher quality education. So it's not that they're very different from each other, but in spirit and in implementation is how are we going to bring all this about is, of course, the question that's, top of every school's mind. So let's look at a little bit at the evolution of early childhood in India itself. It has been around for quite a while. We know there are a lot of Anganwadis. The ICDS scheme was introduced many years ago, which was a great first step towards actually giving early childhood education the importance that it deserves. So I'm not going to go too much into the sector of what's already happening there. We are more interested in looking at what are the things that we need to do to implement ECE. The NCF has borrowed a lot of its content from some of the Indian old ancient texts as well. They talk a lot about the various layers of development, which in today's parlance, to a large extent, we also translate as like physical development, intellectual development, spiritual development, emotional development, and much more. So there is a touch upon every single layer in terms of how it has to be done and how do we bring this about in the schools. So the overall guiding principles, if you look at just these are the guidelines. Now it's up to you in terms of how you're going to interpret it. Then there is a lot of emphasis in terms of individual learning, every child following their own pace, multidisciplinary learning, which means in math, you will have some application of some other area. You have emotional learning combined with intellectual learning. So there's a lot of multidisciplinary approach, and multilingualism has been definitely a big focus area to say children must have multiple language exposure. One of the very interesting aspects is, of course, the focus on formative assessment rather than just being a test paper assessment. So there's a lot of focus in terms of how are we assessing children. If a child is not learning, what should we be doing? So these have been the overall guiding principles of the NEP, which the NCF has taken and adapted to the early years to see how are we going to sort of make this happen. So, of course, the NCF document revolves a lot around the importance of play. And this is something that Kreedo has been saying for a very long time, that play is the nature of the child. Play is the child's work. It's the child's business. It's the child's life. And the way the child defines play and the way we define play is, of course, slightly different. We as an adult, for the child, doing anything actively, being engaged with something is play. It's as simple as that. And what is it that the NCF has recognized in play? That there is choice, which means the child is choosing what to do at that point of time. There is wonder, which means the child is kind of really actively engaged and amazed with what is happening. And that ability to think, to wonder, to then draw conclusions, that's a very significant part of play. And most of all, of course, there's sheer joy and happiness when a child is actively engaged and are excited, whether it's as simple as playing on the slide or playing with a toy. There is a huge amount of joy that the child has in terms of being able to doing things themselves independently, as well as seeing what they're doing, enjoying every minute of it. So this is the sort of summary of play that NCF has sort of summarized in. You can see here there are three types of play that they've very beautifully described. One is, of course, when we think of play, most of us tend to think of play as free play, saying, yeah, bacha khel raha hai, they're all out there, they're just playing by themselves, and there's no rules or regulations, which is what we know as free play, which is completely led by the child as well as directed by the child. Interestingly, what the NCF has also mentioned is that while free play is great, there is a need for teacher intervention when it comes to learning, play-based learning. So one of the focus areas in the NCF has definitely been guided play, where the teacher will show what has to be done in Kreedo parlance or in Kreedo language, or in the Montessori way, we call it giving a presentation, showing the child this is the way it has to be done, after which the child takes over. And just making a mention that every word that's here is directly from the NCF. So we're just taken the text and we're interpreting it in terms of what the understanding is. So in terms of guided play, the teacher initiates that and the child takes over from there and takes play forward in terms of being able to direct their outcomes and being able to find their purpose and so on. So the child takes over, which means the child is in control once the teacher initiates. And there's a lot of emphasis on guided play, which is the overarching theme of NCF when you look at the play section. And the third type of play is structured play, where the teacher is leading it. And for us, this is very, very relevant for classroom activities. So in the classroom activities as well, it doesn't need to be that the teacher is only saying something and the child is repeating. If you want active engagement even in the classroom, let's say, for example, one of the examples that NCF has quoted is, let's say you want the children to write a story, then the teacher sort of guides that story. She gives the thought, she gives the structure, the children start writing, and teachers lead this activity because the child is not there in terms of being able to write a story on their own. So the mixture in our head, to a large extent, there will be a little bit of free play, of course, every day, whether it's in the playground or inside the classroom. That's a smaller portion. A large amount of it needs to be guided play, where the children are interacting with materials, with toys, or with each other as well, where the teacher will lead the activity, start the activity, but the child will lead it. And the third type is structured play, which is largely in the classroom, where teachers are giving something and then they're also leading the activity and helping the children get there. So this is one of the key slides that we really want to talk about, and it's something that's very, very core to every early years program. The types of play that NCF has mentioned is a large number of varieties of play are possible, whether it's playing with toys, playing, like running and catching, hopscotch kind of games where there are rules, role play, I'm a doctor, you're a patient, that kind of role play, exploratory play where, you're taking chana or rajma and decorating something. So they're all varieties of play, and every one of these types has been recognized as a type of play, right? So it's very important to understand that play is not just a very small word, it's a massive world by itself, where there are so many varieties and so many options. Next comes, how are we engaging children for play? So there are various things that you have. There's outdoor play, there are musical instruments, and of course there are, in a Kreedo partner school, there are always materials and toys of the right type, right? So learning through play in terms of conversations, that can also be a type of play. Using the immediate environment, do you see a door which is red in color? Can you see how many beads are stuck on the door over there? How many charts do we have on a wall? So using the immediate environment, and of course learning through play in terms of interaction with material and toys, it's very, very critical. And of course, we've always been in every school in the early years has always been using art, craft, music, and outdoor play. And that's also got a significant mention in the NCF, and that's something that's mandatory to continue. So then comes very interestingly, there is mentions of how do children develop that habit to learn. So how do you make children enjoy learning? How do they develop what we call positive learning habits, that I'm happy to learn, please come and teach me how do you develop the positive learning habits? And for which there are various things mentioned there in terms of, so their children need to develop a way of learning, a way of memorizing, paying attention to detail. It's very important. Allowing children to observe and ask questions is very, very important. How do children also understand classroom routine? When we all, maybe we have to sit silent for 2 minutes, and the children also need to understand how to sit silent for 2 minutes, right? So these are things that are very clearly mentioned in terms of cultivating a positive learning habit is very, very important. One of the very interesting things mentioned when we go to positive learning habit, we've talked about memory and mental flexibility. And very interesting that NCF has clearly documented that memory is not all about rote learning. It's about a lot more than rote. It's about being able to take in things and sort of process them. In order to build memory, what is needed is continuous practice, which is very, very important. Taking cues, I show a red color, somebody remembers an apple, so that sort of cue and making associations and connections, and NCF has clearly documented some of these. I'd like to show how Kreedo thinks about memory. This is one of our slides, not from the NCF, and we've been clear followers of this stage of how to build memory. We start with sensorial activities. We show children certain types of colors, shapes, sizes. The children work with materials, they work with toys. It goes into a temporary memory, which is sensory memory. From there, as they begin to, you give them instructions like go and bring the red piece. That goes into what we call working memory, or like a short-term memory. It's there temporarily, but you don't know when it may go out, which means it has to move to permanent memory, which is long-term memory, and that will happen only with practice. So one of the things that we've been sort of working with in activity-based labs for the last 10 years, and it's working very well for all the schools, is children are now able to learn more because there's a lot more that they can keep in their long-term memory due to practice. So this is something that's very, very intrinsic, and we were so delighted to see the NCF actually mention Smriti as something that's coming from practice and not by rote learning, because that's really a beautiful concept. So one of the things that the NCF very deeply delves into is going from the aim of education right down to every single learning outcome. So what does this mean? Let's take a small example. Our aim of education for Kreedo partner schools, our aim of education is to ensure every child becomes a thinker, which means you have to have good intellectual development. Every child is able to converse and communicate confidently, and at the same time becomes a good citizen, which means socio-emotional development also needs to be there. Now, that's a very high level aim. How do you break it down into various things? So the aim is broken down into various curricular goals, which means you have goals for English, you have goals for mathematics, you have goals for cognitive areas, for science, for social studies, for everything. So it's broken down into curricular goals. Let's take the example of maths. For example, math as a curricular goal could be the child should be, let's say, by the age of 4, the child should be able to read and work with 2-digit numbers. Now, this is a curricular goal. How do you break it down further into competencies, or in our parlance, to some extent, we call them skills? So how do you break a curricular goal down into skills? Which means a child should be able to read a 2-digit number, should be able to match a 2-digit number, should be able to take the number 23 and bring 2 tens and 3 units. If I give the child 2 tens and 3 units, the child should be able to say it's 23. So these are the various competencies that you want the child to build when you're looking at a curricular goal. And then last of all is, of course, learning outcomes, which means the child can count up to 100. The child can find bigger and smaller numbers, which is a learning outcome between any two numbers. So the skills are further broken down into minuscule parts, which is what we call learning outcomes, which is what schools assess in whether it's in a test or whether it's by observation. You can only assess the learning outcomes, and from there we draw the inference that the skill has been built or the competency has been built. So let's move on from competencies to what are the principles that NCF is recommending that every pedagogy should use. What are the principles of pedagogy that they are largely looking at? So it's quite wide, and it's covering everything from a relationship between a teacher and a child, how that has to be very positive, how that has to be the basis of teaching. The core center of the pedagogy, of course, play is central to learning and development. That's been very clearly mentioned in the NCF, and we're really happy that Kreedo has been aligning to this for the last 10 years. And this is something very prominently mentioned in NCF, as that play has to be the center of learning and development at this stage. They're also talking about physical development, which is very important at this stage, which means you can't just make children sit in one place all day long. They have to be allowed to move. They have to be allowed to pick up things. Fine motor and gross motor skills are very, very critical, which means they have to have opportunities to use them. Of course, there's a lot of mention in terms of safety, stimulation. The environment has to be clean, stimulating. There should be something on the wall, so the children are attracted to what's happening there and observing. There's enough to observe inside the school. It can't just be four walls. And learning at their own pace. This is something, again, NCF is bringing up time and again, that between the age of 0 to 6, even 0 to 8 for that matter, children may not all learn at the same pace in the class, which means that there have to be more and more individual planners. In some ways, they should be having opportunities to catch up in some form or the other if they haven't already learned it in the past. So also learning experiences, which are your classroom textbooks and your classroom worksheet inside the classroom. NCF has clearly mentioned the connect between that and daily life experiences. So it should be something that's visible. So kind of like having a purple elephant in the classroom is kind of difficult, because that's difficult for the child to visualize from a daily life context. You'd rather put a red color train there, which the child is very familiar with. So using things that are familiar to the child has been clearly mentioned in the NCF. And one of the key areas, we just discussed competencies and learning outcomes and the aim of education, but what is very, very key, very important for delivering that is a teaching plan. So your teaching plan or your curriculum plan, there's been massive emphasis in the NCF on the planner, on the planning. How are you going to deliver? Okay, you've decided these are going to be your learning outcomes. How are you going to deliver? What is the time duration? What's the timetable? How are children going to be seated? How many teachers are needed for X number of children? So what's the student teacher ratio? What are the strategies for children who have not yet learned? What are the learning toys and learning materials you're going to use? What are the kind of wall displays you're going to use? Every single thing has been mentioned in the NCF as a very critical element of the teaching plan, including methods of assessment. How are you going to assess? When are you going to assess? What is the plan to assess? So Kreedo, of course, has already all of these covered. So we were really thrilled when we read the importance that's being given to a teaching plan, saying we're very clear, here are the outcomes. In order to reach that, these are the 5 things that we have to do. This is how you have to sit. This is how much time maths period should be. This is how much time the lab period should be. And this is how teachers must deliver the activity. So all of these are part of the teaching plan. This is a very interesting concept that has been written about in depth again in the NCF, which is a 5-step teaching process or a learning process. How are you going to get the child to learn? So it's very interesting that these are the 5 stages: Aditi, Bodha, Abhyasa, Prayoga, and Prachara, which means initially you introduce something to the child. The child has not understood it. You've just introduced it. The child begins to maybe have some sense of it. Let's take a simple example of addition. You've shown the child with 5 rajmas and 6 chanas. You've showed the child how to put it together. The child is somewhat familiar. Now the child begins to understand conceptually, acha, putting 2 things together is addition. So that is bodha. But the child will really truly understand addition only when they practice. So just by showing it one time or showing a demo is not enough. You have to give sufficient time for children to practice addition over and over again with a variety of materials in the classroom, various ways, which is where abhyasa or practice comes in. And then application. Okay, now that I know what is 5 plus 6, can I apply that somewhere in a worksheet, where a worksheet is given which is saying 5 plus 6 in an abstract way? Will the child be able to draw and add, or will the child be able to just add, which is the application in some ways in a book or in theory? And from there is prachara or expansion. And the way Kreedo has looked at prachara is to say, now can you use 5, now that you know how to do 5 plus 6, can we now move to 15 plus 6? So can you do the same process, but now we're going to go one place value more, and we're going to introduce the next step because the child already knows 5 plus 6. So this is the 5-step learning process. And for us at Kreedo, this is something that again is very, very intrinsic to us. This is exactly the same that we've been doing for years. We start with presentation, allow the child to practice with the material, get the child to a certain competency level in the lab. Then you take the same concept to the classroom and start doing worksheets. Once the child is over with that level, then we move the child to the next level. So this is a very, very, again, very clear cut and very illustrative way of for the teachers to understand these are the 5 stages that I need to take the child through. This is how Kreedo practices learning, and this is something that's very, very key to us over the years as we have worked with children and we've been working with schools and teachers. This is sort of the summary of what we have come to, that yes, all types of learning modes are necessary, but we largely focus on 3 types of learning: by construction, which is what bodha or abhyasa stage refers to. So you give the materials, get the children to practice, they play with toys, they have experiences which help them learn, and then they keep practicing. So that's stage number 1, which is learning by construction. Stage number 2 is learning with the peers. So just by having all the children together in one place, one child is doing addition, another child is doing reading some words, just by being with each other and watching what is that child doing, what is he doing, what is she doing, children start learning more. And this is what we call learning with peers, right? So socialization is learning with peers to a large extent. And the third, which is a little bit of rote learning or learning by instruction, which is what we call teacher led or by instructions led by the teacher, which is structured play in some ways, that's led by the teacher. So the teachers guide and the children listen and imbibe. So this is Kreedo's learning philosophy, which is very closely linked to what you just saw on the previous slide. So this is the 4-block approach that that is mentioned in terms of what are the things that you need to do. Let's say, for example, for literacy, and these are all guidelines. This is not the entire language, sort of focused in one. There are various blocks like this. So in language, it's really nice that they're talking about oral, which is speaking and listening skills largely, which is oral language development, and reading aloud, which is sort of an extension of that. And there is also mention of things like word recognition, which means now you have to write the letters, you have to read the letters, you have to read the words. So it's pretty much the LSRW to a large extent: listening, speaking, reading, and writing covered with the 4 blocks. And of course, again, with Kreedo, we've been doing a lot of these things in terms of tracing sandpaper letter. Then we recognize the letter, we listen to the sound. Once we listen to the sounds, we start listening to the words. Then we start doing word formation. But parallelly, it's also important to have conversations, to develop the spoken English, to develop the spoken mother tongue. And any language, you need to have all the 4 elements. You can't just do reading and writing or only listening and speaking. It's a combination of all the 4 if you want the child to truly understand that language. Similarly, in numeracy, there is a 4-block method of teaching, which is again, there is rote learning or oral math talk, which I'm sure all the schools must be doing. So there is, for example, you would do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 every day in your classroom. That's just to register the names of the numbers in the child's head: 10, 20, 30, 40, or a nursery rhyme about numbers: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, once I caught a fish alive. So all of this is what goes into oral math talk. Then, of course, there's a lot of emphasis on skills teaching in maths, which means you need to have materials that allow the child to learn counting, that allow the child to learn place value, subtraction, multiplication. Everything has to be initiated with the skill. Once the child is reasonably there at a skill level, then they go into practicing those skills on their own. As you can see, this child is working on their own to sort of figure what are the numbers, what are the number system. And then you go into worksheets or problem solving, which is the abstract learning. So again, clearly mentioned in the NCF in terms of moving, having some rote component with oral, having practical learning, and having theoretical learning. Children develop mathematical understanding. This is just one of the many examples mentioned and illustrated beautifully in the NCF in terms of saying here is a way that the child will move from the age of 3 to the age of 8 at various stages. The child will start with sorting, then they'll do counting, then they'll do forward and backward counting, then they will do 2-digit numbers, they'll do addition, they'll do subtraction, then they do measurement of length. And what was unbelievable was that Kreedo has almost exactly again the same flow, and we were really delighted to see the focus that NCF has given and the detailing that they have given on how do you take a child from point A to point B over a period of 1 year. So there are it's broken down beautifully into various concepts in terms of what are you going to take the child from the age of 3 to the age of 8, which is the entire block. So I would like to emphasize here again, when we're talking about foundational learning, it's no longer 3 to 6. We're talking here about the 3 to 8 age group, which means you're talking pre-primary plus grade 1 and grade 2, which has also become part of pre-primary. So this is what is called the foundational stage. The next stage, which is the third, fourth, fifth, is what they call the preparatory stage. So this is everything that you need to know before the child enters the preparatory, or what we in traditional language call the primary years. So before class 3, what are the things that the child must come equipped with? One of the things that and NCF really clearly is sort of starting with and talking constantly about in the beginning is the problems that we're facing in terms of learning. There are quite a few mentions of the literacy and numeracy issues that children face, because either they don't go through sufficient learning in early years, or they've never gone to a preschool and they've directly come to first standard, which they're seeing a huge number of children facing. NCF has even talked about, so there are 11.7 lakh schools, government or aided schools across the country, and only 4 lakh schools actually have either their own pre-primary section, or they're associated with the Anganwadi. 7 lakh schools, even in the government sector, do not have an association with the pre-primary stage. And this is something that NCF is clearly mentioning, that every child must have early education. Otherwise, the delay or the gap that is there in the child is they're seeing long-term effects and long-term repercussions for it, which means it's going to be a struggle for the child to catch up if you don't do this on time. So they're talking a lot about, in fact, there's even a mention in terms of while Anganwadis have done a great job in terms of safety and health and hygiene, there's still a lot to be desired in terms of the education outcomes that they're able to produce, because the focus has not been on education. And this is something that we're constantly telling all our partner schools, that at the end of the day, schools are here to deliver learning, and that's something that we really need to sort of keep in mind. So here are some things that they've also said about for what should teachers do. So we've talked about curriculum, we've talked about planning, we've talked a little bit about assessment. So what should the teacher be doing? So there are quite a few guidelines that the NCF has given in terms of how teachers should behave with children. What is the voice tone you have to use? How should your body language be? What kind of words should you be using? Instead of saying, no, this is not possible, can we say, can you try this instead? So there are some very clear-cut guidelines again for the teachers to, the way the relationship needs to be built between the teacher and the child. There are quite a few guidelines, and I think this is a session by itself. So one of these days, we'll probably go a lot deeper in terms of what is the language used by the teacher and what she should be doing. Right? So in order for teachers to do all of these, The NCF has also very clearly documented how should teachers training be done, what should teachers know, and what do teachers need in order for them to deliver learning. So there is a lot of mention in terms of what are the materials they need, the kind of environments that schools should have for teachers. They should understand the content that they're delivering. So it's not just about completing portions. Teachers need to understand, why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you doing early literacy? What are your expectations from the children once you have done that? What are the outcomes that you're expecting to achieve for every child? What is your methodology that you're doing? And in Credo, I think we have sort of predefined all these things. So when we do our teacher training, we have every one of these elements covered, even in terms of assessment. How are you going to assess children? If the child has not learned, what is it that you're going to do? What is it that you're going to, how are the remedials going to be conducted? So Credo already has a lot of these, and this is something that again is very, very important, that teachers keep developing themselves. And we have organizations like Credo that are here to help teachers develop professionally. But it's very important that teachers also understand their own career path, and their own goals should be linked to understanding all of these, understanding how content is delivered, what the curriculum is, and so on. Technology has a mention in NCF. They have definitely mentioned that you cannot go away from technology now. It's here to stay. Children are on certain types of digital content and digital platforms, but what is the amount of time that you should allow them to spend on tech? How should tech be used? It's very interesting that the NCF says tech should be used a lot more for teacher development, a lot more for aiding teachers a little bit in terms of audiovisual content, maybe in the school for a small extent. But more importantly, it's talking about how tech should be used for capacity building, which means how can we train teachers more using technology? How can teachers have planners at their fingertips? How can teachers do assessment using technology? And then there is, the remedials become very easy, saying ABC children don't know addition. Here are 3 materials that we can use. There is a lot of mention in terms of Divyang or inclusion, technology for special needs children. How can you engage them more with tech to enable them to catch up with what you have to do? So there is mention of that in terms of more of special needs and difficulties in learning which can be overcome using tech. But there is definitely mention in terms of the limitation of tech and where you should not be excessively using tech. So tech which is just appropriate and which is just sufficient for teachers and as well as for children is something that has been mentioned. Now, coming to the methods of assessment which have been mentioned, there is observation. There has to be an observation way of recording things, and there has to be analyzing things, like the child has done a piece of drawing. How are you going to analyze that? So these are the 3 methods and tools that have been largely overall mentioned in the NCF in terms of how are you going to plan, how are you going to observe the child, how are you going to collect evidence, and how are you going to reflect and assess, okay, this child hasn't learned, now what am I going to do next? Similarly, a lot of anecdotal records have been mentioned for schools where it's possible for teachers to write down those small little things. Today I saw Arav helping Tejas. So this is something that, it's very nice to mention, and you understand that the child is also developing socially, is developing emotionally. So if there is possibility for teachers to write down those little notes, they're a great way of maintaining records in terms of how is the child developing. And similarly, all the books itself become an artifact, a worksheet or a book. So it's very important to look at that and say, how far has the child progressed? How good is it? How independent is their work, and so on. So all these 3 become methods and tools of assessment. Huge mention on holistic progress card, which means it's not enough to give a marks card to a child saying 4 out of 5. What we're interested in knowing is, how have children learned a particular competency? Have they achieved the learning outcome that is expected from them? Are they able to, for example, use verbs in a sentence, do 2-digit addition, and so on? So a skill report card is a mandate. A competency report card is what NCF is expecting. And it's mentioned in the NEP also very strongly that progress should be holistic. It's not about saying 5 out of 10 in maths. We need to understand what that really means, what competencies has the child already developed, and what are the competencies that we need to yet help the child to get there. So this is something that's been, again, a clear-cut focus. So collecting data, acting on the data, which is largely remedial practice. So just because the child doesn't know addition doesn't mean you're just going to skip that element, which means we have to go back and find some way of delivering education as a learning outcome, addition as a learning outcome to the child. So again, this is another slide on assessment that they have mentioned. How should a teacher do assessment? She needs to be objective. The assessment should be clearly designed, which means everything that you're putting on a paper, which is what we do in our Kreedo assessment papers. Every question that we have on our Kreedo assessment is aligned to some learning outcome that we are expecting, and hence we're able to analyze whether the child has achieved that. When the teacher is doing observation for assessment, she also needs to watch, is the child able to arrange everything in a straight line? Does the child know 3 is bigger than 2? So these are things that the teachers can observe and assess as well, and know that yes, this child has already acquired this skill. So it is also emphasizing that there should not be only one way of assessing, there should be multiple ways of assessing, so that you have various forms of evidence, and teachers need to be unbiased and objective when they're doing assessment, not have preconceived notions in their mind in terms of while they're doing any kind of assessment and evidence collection. Once that evidence has been collected, then the teachers will look at revision, practice skills. How do I get these children to learn more? Which are the children that, maybe these 5 children need additional storytelling. They need to communicate more. Can I get them to sort of speak more in the classroom? So all of these is what happens once you know that these are the children who are struggling for specific competencies. They have not achieved those competencies, which means you'll start organizing learning experiences based on that. Again, in Kreedo, this is something that we've always been harping on, saying if the child hasn't learned A, B, and C, we just take the child back to the lab to develop it if that's a possibility, or we give some other option in terms of saying, get the child to speak, or this is what you need to do. But there needs to be a remedial activity once you know a child has not achieved a specific competency. So here's a example of a daily routine, a very basic timetable. This is just one of the many timetables mentioned again in the NCF, and they're talking, this is for the age 3 to 6 that they have mentioned. So there is very clearly an hour set aside for, in our heads, it's like the lab time or the individual work time as we call it. It's for pre-numeracy, pre-literacy, that we sort of work on materials, we work on skills. The 45-minute corner time can be either in the lab or in the classroom, but these are things that they have mentioned where children can do things in groups in different corners, so all 40 children don't need to do the same thing at the same time. So some of these in Kreedo timetables, we have morphed them in a way where all of this is covered, but it's maybe under different names and so on. But this is a very high level timetable routine which is given as an example, and there is emphasis every day on language time, on story time, on communication time. I would say more than even just story time or rhyme time, it is about communication. So there is mention of rhymes being for a shorter period, more longer period being on language communication and speaking, or a theme time and so on, and a good amount of time to be spent on things like material time, which is what we call the Kreedo lab time in our context. This is a similar routine for the 6 to 8. So you can see that it's very similar in terms of the pattern. So the NCF is not differentiating too much between the 3 to 6 and 6 to 8, except that 6 to 8 can also have textbooks and things. Clearly mentioned the 3 to 6 should have only workbooks and worksheets and not textbook kind of format. But the 6 to 8 can start having some illustrative textbooks and so on. But otherwise, in terms of the timetable formats or the way learning has to be delivered, it's pretty much common across the entire age group of 3 to 8, which means even these children need to have their lab time, they need to have their concept learning time, they need to have the individual time when they are working with materials to a large extent. So here's an example of the entire, just a small example of one of the many areas mentioned again in terms of the learning outcome, starting from differentiating between red and blue color at a very young age, going up to using colors in art, which is application by the age of 8. So every one of these is illustrating how the child must progress from stage 1 to stage 5 between the age of 3 to 8, which is something that they have beautifully illustrated in the NCF. Here's another example of how a child will go from the age of 3 to 8 in let's say 2-digit numbers, or small and short, and increasing order, decreasing order, arranging in ascending and descending order. So each of these is mentioned in terms of various ways of illustrating how children move through a sequence of learning outcomes in some ways. Similarly, for language, this is an example. So they just start with drawing, and then finally they're actually able to do story writing with drawing. So here's a sequence of learning outcomes over the years that takes the child from stage 1 to stage 5 again. So that's pretty much to a large extent what NCF had to say. I just want to end with summarizing what Kreedo has to offer before we take question answers, and we're happy to take question answers after this. In terms of having things to learn, the toys, the peer learning, and the classroom content, these, what you see on the left side of the screen, is what we call our learning elements, which means you have materials, you have books, and you have other children, all three of which are learning elements. And how do we give the support elements in order for teachers to be trained, your day, everything that's mentioned in the NCF in terms of you should have a daily routine, there should be a planner, there should be assessment, there should be skill cards, report cards, and so on. All of those is what goes into our support elements. So this is sort of a summary of what really Kreedo has in many ways. And I'm going to stop screen sharing and open this up to questions. So we would be happy to sort of start taking questions from here on. Yeah, I hope all of you were able to sort of see a large part of that presentation. And yeah, please feel free to we are happy to take questions in terms of any questions that you have in terms of curriculum, learning, how you should implement it in the school. Please do go ahead, and you can put it in the chat window. Logistics and other questions answered outside this session. So anything that you want to ask in terms of how grade 1 curriculum should happen, or what is the integration, we will be more than happy to answer those. While I'm not yet seeing any questions there, so I'm going to be, I'll just take up also the indicator that they have given on how pre-primary is linked to the preparatory stage. So the foundational stage is all about domains of development, areas of development, emotional development, physical development, cognitive development. In the grade 3, when you go into the what we call the preparatory stage, it moves into what you call in some ways subject, but more into curriculum areas. So that's the change that they're seeing, to go from foundational stage to preparatory stage, where then it becomes more like the world around us, or the science and social studies, versus in the foundational stage we're still talking about the areas of development. And there's been again a lot of emphasis in terms of saying that the whole area of development is should be multidisciplinary, and it should be sort of looked at as like literacy, numeracy, again a huge amount of importance in terms of just foundational literacy and numeracy, and saying before the child enters the preparatory stage, which is grade 3, the child must have acquired all these skills. Otherwise there's a problem at the foundational stage which cannot be fulfilled, right? So those are things that they have clearly mentioned in terms of how it has to be implemented. What is the age criteria? It is clearly mentioned in the NCF as 3 to 8. Now for the states, which are, this is going to be a statewide matter. So it depends on the state in which you are. Bangalore is already, Karnataka is pretty much aligned with that. So in Karnataka, I think we will be definitely in the 3 to 8 will be the age criteria in terms of starting at nursery at 3 and going into grade 3 after 8, which means the child is in first standard when the child crosses 6 years old. So 3 to 6 is nursery, LKG, UKG, 6 to 8 is first and second standard. So that's the way the age criteria has been. But this is going to be a state subject. Again, I'm repeating. So it depends on what your stage, what your state is implementing as a policy. There is a question here in terms of assessment system of grade. I'm assuming that's grade 1 and 2. It's going to be similar. So you will have to have a mix of a little bit of oral assessment, a little bit of paper-based assessment, a little bit of, it's good to do assessment by observation, for which also Creedo will give you guidelines in terms of what can you look at and fill in. So as much of variety of assessment that you can do is good. But from Creedo, we have already mapped all our assessment to learning outcomes and competencies, which means even if you're following the Creedo assessment schedule as dictated by Creedo, it's still going to work for you. So it should not be a problem. So yeah, I mean, yes, there's been a lot of change in terms of how we have structured the books, and we are really excited that a lot of that new structuring that we have done is very much aligned to the NCF thoughts, the spirit of NCF in terms of sort of saying that every child must have play, classroom activities should be linked to play, teachers should be taught how to, sort of link the two. All of that is already present in Creedo. So even our themes, the way we have structured, we've gone more into helping children understand basic functionality in the themes, which is something that NCF again is very, very strongly recommending. So which is great for alignment with the NCF. Is Creedo planning smart classes for grade 1? And we already have what we call, English Helper as an app as part of Creedo. So that's already there. There is going to be definitely some limitation in terms of smart classes from the government side also. Not to use smart classes excessively is definitely something that has been indicated. It has not been mentioned as you should or should not. But the guideline again is, don't overdo things like smart class in early years. Yes, we will offer digital content for sure. And that's something that we are already putting a lot of AV content into schools in terms of being directly mapped with what we are already teaching in the books. So we don't want to just show AV content for the sake of showing AV content, just showing some story or which is unrelated or which the child can't relate to, or showing a mountain which is not part of the syllabus at all. That's something that we're not doing too much of. We consciously kept away from that in early years in the foundational stage. But as the children get older, there will be changes in formats, and we definitely already have some digital content which is mapped to our books, and that will sort of keep continuing to grow. If the child is 5 years and 11 months, is the child eligible to get into grade 1? Honestly, those are not questions that we can answer. Is your state allowing you to do that? You really have to, sort of ask the parent to take that risk. It may come to it that in 10th standard, the child is not allowed to write the exam, and that can be a huge roadblock for the child at that point of time. So this is definitely an individual discussion that you need to have with the parent. And depending on your state's policy, if you're in Tamil Nadu, for example, I know NEP hasn't yet been implemented over there. So it's up to the state to define some of these guidelines. NCF is clearly mentioning it as 3 to 8. That's during admission of LKG. Is it a mandate for LKG student to know writing alphabet for a student who's directly joining LKG without nursery? Absolutely no. Creedo has already budgeted for 85% of the children to come for the first time in LKG. Hardly 15% children are coming from nursery. So in fact, that 5 years has already become 4 years in the foundational stage for majority of the children. We know parents don't admit their children very easily in the nursery level at all. It's usually in LKG that they're directly coming into. And no, it's not at all. We're going into revision for the first 2 months almost in LKG, which means we're starting right from scratch, right from the phonetic sounds for the child to say which, with b and d and so on, and writing alphabet. We are starting right from there before we go into 3-letter word writing, which is the first chapter, which comes after a good 2 months in school. So no, there's no expectation of that the child must know. Even if the child doesn't know, as long as it's a LKG entry, it's still manageable. The bigger struggle is if somebody comes directly in UKG, it's still a struggle. It's not easy for the child. But that's also something that happens. So no, NEP hasn't yet been implemented over there. So it's up to the state to define some of these guidelines. NCF is clearly mentioning it as 3 to 8. That's all I can say. I really can't take questions in terms of is it allowed. That's between you, the parent, and the state in which you are. So between the three of you, you really need to take the right call based on that. During admission of LKG, is it a mandate for LKG student to know writing alphabet for a student who's directly joining LKG without nursery? Absolutely no. Creedo has already budgeted for 85% of the children to come for the first time in LKG. Hardly 15% children are coming from nursery. So in fact, that 5 years has already become 4 years in the foundational stage for majority of the children. We know parents don't admit their children very easily in the nursery level at all. It's usually in LKG that they're directly coming into. And no, it's not at all. We're going into revision for the first 2 months almost in LKG, which means we're starting right from scratch, right from the phonetic sounds for the child to say which, with b and d and so on, and writing alphabet. We're starting right from there before we go into 3-letter word writing, which is the first chapter, which comes after a good 2 months in school. So no, there's no expectation of that the child must know. Even if the child doesn't know, as long as it's a LKG entry, it's still manageable. The bigger struggle is if somebody comes directly in UKG, it's still a struggle. It's not easy for the child, but that's also something that happens. So our revision, even in the UKG level, covers a lot of the basics, and that's something that we, even in grade 1 and grade 2, we have gone back to a lot of the basic revision. And what is very interesting for us this year is we've added what we call the lab book. We're very excited about that. So far in the lab, it is just play-based learning where the children are doing with the materials, and then they go into the classroom and doing the worksheet. The lab book will be sort of in between the two, where they can work with material but fill the answers in the lab book, like a lab record there itself, which we feel will transition the gap between the lab and between the classroom. So if you know a child is struggling with addition in the lab, it becomes much easier to spot, because the child will find it difficult even with the material to do that. And once the child is able to do that, that means the classroom will become much easier. So that's something that we've added in this year to bridge that gap. And this is not there for nursery children. This is there from LKG to grade 2. All the children will be getting a lab book for every year, which will include a lot of activities which the children can do with the materials, but record it in the book. For nursery, yes, for every level, levels, we have looked at the content in terms of cutting down a few concepts, but more importantly, illustrating them a little differently, doing more practical exercises. So I think all of you will be quite happy to see the new set of books, which is like really beautiful, with a cover which we have specially designed so that the children can keep the whole book set even at home on their table and be sort of more organized about it. So I think we are also quite excited to sort of share all the new books with all of you. I think level 1 and level 2 have already started being dispatched to a lot of the schools, and level 3 will start going out from next week onwards. So the additional theme books, there are only 2 theme books right now that we have, which is 4 themes combined into one. The content is significantly reduced, and no, you cannot just say that you do only foundational literacy or numeracy, because in the language book, we're doing only the reading and writing elements of language. So the listening and speaking elements of language will get covered in the themes, which NCF has laid a lot of emphasis on. So in fact, the theme books are going to cover a lot of the listening and speaking skills for language, which is very, very high priority. Again and again, NCF has been mentioning that it's very important that children listen to the words that are being said, and it's not just about reading and writing. It's not just about that. Literacy is not about that. Is it okay to market your school as NEP? Absolutely. If you're following Kreedo, you will be fully NCF compliant. Every single word written in that document, it's almost made for Kreedo. So we are super thrilled to, sort of see the emphasis and same things that we've been saying about assessment, about play-based learning, about guided play, about structured play. Everything that Kreedo does, even in terms of assessment, teacher mentoring, everything is completely NCF compliant. So yes, you can definitely say NEP compliant for your school. Will playgroup be part of preschool? As per NEP, no, 0 to 3 has been treated differently. So it's only the 3 to 8 stage that they're talking about as the foundational stage. Pre-3 is still healthcare, a little bit of learning and education, which is the Anganwadi sector, which they're talking about, where a lot of children between 2 and 3 are in that space. So it's not a defined curriculum. Yes, Kreedo has given you guidelines, and even there it's okay to do what we call emergent skills or pre-reading or pre-numeracy skills, which is coloring or sorting or just working with colors and paints and using a lot more of physical development will be the emphasis for the 2 to 3 age group. So yes, 2 to 3 you can have, but that's not part of the foundational stage. As far as NCF is concerned, it's recognizing the foundational stage only from 3 onwards. So playgroup is not something that they have consciously stayed away from, including that as part of the foundational stage. But you can do a lot of pre-literacy and pre-numeracy skills in the playgroup sector. So yeah, I mean, can you touch on that, Kunal? Again, I'm repeating, this is the 3 to 8 age group that we're talking about for foundational stage. We're talking about 0 to 3 is a different age group. 3 to 8 is foundational. 3rd, 4th, 5th standard is what we call the preparatory stage, which is 8 upwards, the 9 to 11 age group to a large extent. Right. So this is, something that NCF has mentioned. How do you implement for a child directly take an admission to grade 2? I don't have an answer to that question at all. Very clearly mentioned in the NCF saying the child needs to have a certain skill level before they go to grade 3. Are you going to be able to do entire 5 years portion in 1 year? It will be a huge burden on the child unless the child has come already with some pre-literacy and pre-numeracy skills and already know a certain amount. I don't think that's even a doable thing. It's very unfair to even ask the child to finish doing 5 years learning outcomes in 1 year. So not a possibility. That delay will show you at least they need to start from grade 1. You can't have a child coming to school for the first time in grade 2, especially if the child has had no exposure at home. NCF also mentions the difference between advantaged and disadvantaged children who have been exposed to learning in the house, who have something at home to learn from, maybe parents have taught them, which is an advantage that they'll come with. But if the child is coming with absolutely no skills, it's so unfair to expect the child to just finish learning everything within a year, which is a discussion that you certainly must have about with the parent in terms of being unable to deal with something like this in grade 2. The timetable has been clearly mentioned again in NCF. There are various illustrations and the guidelines that we are giving you in terms of timetable, saying you need to have a play time, you need to have an art time, you need to have math period, you need to have English period, where you'll do spoken English, you need to have a lab time, you need to have activities which will help the children become emotionally better, smarter, speaking in front of an audience, allowing children to ask a lot of questions in the classroom. So there's a lot of mention about all of these, and that's really something that is clearly mentioned in terms of timetable, as well as what are the things the children need to be exposed to a large extent, which are the events. If you start 3 to 8, how will the pass out integrate into another board like state or central? There's no question of board alignment. If you're following Kreedo for the 3 to 8, the child will be aligned with every board. So there is absolutely no board alignment problem. What will be the issue is your regulatory authorities. If the next school mandates a TC, then you need to have the ability to issue a TC. If that's a mandate, that's still not come about in many states. So I know a lot of preschools are also running till second standard because the parents are so happy with the kind of learning that's happening in the school that they don't want children to go to a bigger school till third standard. So this is again a state subject. Is your TC mandatory? What are your regulatory authorities saying? Is it something that you're going to be able to do? You really need to check with your PEO. Yes, first and second standard has become part of the foundational stage, which means technically it's a part of a preschool in the thought process, definitely. What are the regulatory requirements that is needed? That hasn't changed yet. Again, it's a state subject. So you need to go to your BEO office and do the necessary, registrations that are needed for class 1 and 2. And I'm sure we are going to see some of those regulations coming in to say, can grade 1 and 2 be included in pre-primary? We have not yet seen that in any state happening, but it will happen soon enough, because now that the NCF is still a guideline, when people start saying I'm NCF compliant, that means that first and second standard also needs to have similar regulation as pre-primary, but we are sort of yet to see that over there to a large extent. If the child has come from traditional learning since grade 1 and wants to join Kreedo, yes, I know a lot of you are starting grade 1. Parents are thrilled to come into the Kreedo environment even in grade 1 and 2, and it's not a bad thing. It is going to be tough, let me warn you upfront. It's not easy, but because you have the lab, which is a huge help to you, you must take the children for 6 months at least to the pre-primary lab every day, at least for 3 to 4 months, and then parallelly also take them to the grade 1 lab. For them to be able to cope up with some of these things, you may need to create an individual planner for those children. For certain things, maybe you want to give them just last year's math book or last year's lab book and get them to do lab activities in the, in the lab time of the previous year, so that some of the things which they've never done before, like maybe they've never done subtraction or multiplication before, they need to know that before they get to the grade 1 level. But in our grade 1 revision, all this is already included. So even if the child just goes through the grade 1 revision, but maybe in a little more detail you may have to spend, the child can catch up. It's not too much of a worry, assuming the child has already gone to some school before and has learned some things and come. So we're not starting from 1 to 10. We assume that the child knows numbers up to 100. The child knows some basic addition, which is the assumption. And then after that is when, we need to work on the additional things that the child has probably not learned, because the child has not been in a Kreedo school. So they may not know some of those things in terms of, how to get that done. So yeah, I mean, it's not easy. So yeah, I mean, I don't think you should say no to a child coming to class 1 to your school, as long as they've learned something and come. So it can't be like starting a first time entry into grade 2 is not possible, but gone to some other school, then coming to your school, we can still live with that. We can still get the child into some level of practice. What curriculum should be mentioned to parents for grade 1 and 2? It's a Kreedo curriculum. It's NCF aligned. Simple, as straightforward as that. No need to say Montessori plus CBSE plus. It depends. If you are running a 1st to 10th standard school, then whatever your board is, that is the same. If you are running a preschool and you're extending to class 1 and 2, then it's still a Kreedo curriculum, which is NCF compliant. So yes, the Kreedo is very much Montessori based. So you can definitely mention that it's a Montessori based, curriculum, but it's NCF compliant curriculum, which has everything from play based learning to guided play to structured play. That's something that's sort of, something that's Kreedo is doing significantly. Notice that parents don't actively participate. You really need to have more ways of engaging with the parents. So don't try and call too many, parent teacher meetings which are direct. Always try and make it, around some activity where they want to come and see the children. I understand this is a struggle for a lot of schools, saying we call parents but they're not coming. But it really comes down to the relationship that you're building with your parents. Try and keep them on your side. It's something that you both are jointly bringing up the child together, literally. So parents need to see you as a partner, not just as an opposition, literally. So that's something that you really have to work on in terms of your relationship. And yeah, show the parent that if you do these 3 things, I can get your child to this competency level, else it's difficult. So try and get, the engagement of the parents in voluntarily, rather than by forcing the parents to come for certain PTMs and so on. How to deal with admission in mid sessions? Start from scratch. That's exactly what the NCF is saying, that you should be able to work with any child at any pace, that the child should have an individual planner, that the child should be able to pick up things at any point on an individual basis. That means if a child doesn't know how to do counting, you should be able to work with the child. So it doesn't matter whether the child is joining in the beginning or after 3 months, you should have a plan to help the child catch up, which is something that Kreedo can do. We need the start date and the end date, and there are customized planners. So that's not a difficulty for Kreedo. It's just a matter of starting the curriculum at that point of time. Yes, there'll be a little bit of delay in terms of worksheet numbers. They'll be behind, but they can catch up by the end of the year. That's not a problem. Montessori is mixed age group. Yes, it is mixed age group. Kreedo, we have been saying the classrooms are not mixed age group. So when you go back to your English period or your math period, that's not a mixed age group. But in the lab, if we can have 2 different sections come in at the same time, if you can have a mixed age group, it works beautifully, because there is enough material for everybody. And it's really great to see children from learning from each other. Peer learning is very, very useful. So it's good to keep the lab as a mixed age group. Even if you're a big school, if you can bring 20, if you have 30 children in LKG and 30 in UKG, if you can bring both the age sections in together, that's the best way of learning. So that's something that Kreedo has always spoken about, and we hope to sort of, make sure that schools are able to build a timetable where there's at least a little bit of mixed age grouping every day. How to make physical exercise more systematic? Great question. We will try and do something about it in terms of giving a more structured physical program. But overall, I think the free play time that you have should be really used for a lot of physical running around. So, we're good to have. Jyoti, I hope that answers your question. We're good to just let go during the physical period because we have a lot of fine motor and gross motor skill being used inside the Kreedo lab. But during the pre-play time, when you're letting the children out, it's good to get those bigger movements, hopping, catching, running, jumping. Very basic. It really doesn't need more thought process than that, because you want the child to use every part of the body, and that's really what is needed. It doesn't need to be structured physical play also. It can be unstructured, and that could be used as your free play time, which is what we usually recommend in Kreedo. But we're happy to sort of provide for more guidelines for those activities if people want to do guided play rather than free play during the physical activity time. Grade 1 and 2, please have just home teacher. Again, a big request to all of you, do not need subject-wise teachers for grade 1 and 2, except maybe for a second language or a PT where you feel, that teacher will not be able to do it. Please have the same teacher can definitely deal with English, maths, and a lab period and a theme period. There are only 4 periods along with maybe a little bit of logical reasoning. They're all connected. It's multidisciplinary. Same teacher can learn all the subjects. Grade 1 and 2 is too early to start having subject-wise teachers. And this is exactly what the NCF is also meaning, saying grade 1 and 2 is part of the foundation stage. In the preparatory stage, you can go for subject teachers. In the foundation stage, you don't need subject-wise teachers. It's very basic. How difficult is it for a teacher to get done subtraction as well as reading? It's not very difficult. So every teacher, I'm sure, is going to be able to manage that. So request you, please do not have subject-wise teachers for your grade 1 and 2. We definitely need a home teacher only. How many teachers do you need in one class for 20 students? One is more than enough as far as teaching is concerned. It's good to have one support teacher if you have multiple sections. So if you have 4 or 5 sections, you can have one support teacher, so that if a teacher is absent on any day, you should have a backup. You can't ask some other teacher to come and manage 40. It throws a lot of things out of gear. So per section, one teacher is good enough. With one support teacher for across the whole, maybe foundation stage, you can have 1 or 2 support teachers, so that if they need a backup, if that teacher is absent, then there has to be somebody who can be a backup in their place. So I think that's pretty much answered. I think all the questions that we have had here. I know there are a whole lot more. We will have a repeat of this session soon enough in terms of more of curriculum outlines and curriculum guidelines, as well as some of your questions which are regulation related. I think those we need to do individually. We have to have a state-wise demarcation on those questions. So we will be happy to answer those separately, individually. But on curriculum, guidelines, timetable, teacher training, how do we certify teachers? How can we ensure teachers are competent enough to, sort of deliver that education? We hope to have a repeat session soon. Thank you so much for your patience. And I think we'll take the next set of questions in the next session. Thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure to do this session with all of you for the first time. So thank you. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. And we look forward to our individual discussions with each of you shortly.